everyone, my name is Kudzie Mapiye, and on this channel I do videos about my life living here in Australia, and I also share different life lessons that I've learned along the way. In today's video I'm going to be talking about the housing crisis in Queensland, particularly in the city of Brisbane. Now, this has been ongoing for a few years now, and it is quite serious. Now, this impacts current residents of Brisbane, anyone looking to move to Brisbane from interstate who is currently living in Australia, or people who are looking to immigrate to Australia and are choosing Brisbane as their city to live. Now, I'm just going to show you a short clip that was on the news just to highlight the seriousness of, this housing crisis and how many families are unfortunately finding themselves homeless here in Brisbane.
Queensland's housing crisis is deepening tonight, with an alarming number of families needing help across the state. Many now resorting to tents in city parks as the Lord Mayor calls for urgent action.
Tents are now popping up in South Brisbane's Musgrave Park. It's a confronting reality for families and individuals who are running out of options.
Now, as you can see from that clip, it is really, really sad. You have families, you have professionals who are finding themselves homeless. And, before, people used to think homelessness is only happens to people from a certain demographic. But now homelessness is impacting quite a lot of people. Almost anyone who is in the rental market is at risk of being homeless. And I know that, at my work, I actually know of 2 people who were having to live in their cars, and they're still coming to work, but they were having to live in their cars because they didn't have a place to rent. Not because they couldn't afford a place to rent, but because there is so much pressure at the moment on the rental market because there is a housing shortage. There are less houses to go around compared to the people who need the housing. And it's quite sad, when you work with people and you hear that they're living in the car, that is quite confronting. Then you see that, look, this is something that can impact absolutely anybody. So today I'm just going to dive a little bit deeper into that, look at the reasons why this is happening and some of the things that you can do to protect yourself and make sure that you have the best chance of securing housing here in Brisbane. Now, I'm just going to go into some of the reasons why there is a rental housing crisis in Brisbane at the moment. Firstly, it's because there is a housing shortage. There are more people in the city than we have houses. And the reason for that is because, there are a lot of builders who have gone out of business because of the COVID pandemic. There has been a lot of immigration that has taken place, a lot of immigration from people from outside of Australia moving to Brisbane, and also people from interstate moving to Brisbane. And this mainly happened during and after COVID. And Brisbane was one of the Brisbane and Queensland, I'll just say the state of Queensland was one of the ones which had the most tightest controls when it came to COVID. And we had very few numbers in terms of deaths that were occurring compared to other states. And also because the weather in Brisbane is quite good, and during the pandemic people were escaping states that had colder weathers, trying to move to a state with warmer weather like Queensland, where you find Brisbane. So those are some of the reasons why we started to have an influx of people moving to Brisbane, leading to the housing crisis. And so, those are some of the reasons that, we are in a housing crisis at the moment. And, another thing is the cost of living. The cost of living pressures are finding some families unable to secure rentals because the rental prices have skyrocketed in Brisbane. I'll give you an example of the suburb that I live in now. Now, I live in a newly developed area. And by newly developed, I mean in the last 10 years is when this suburb was kind of set up. The area of the suburb that I live in the past kind of 10 years. And when I moved in this street, if you've seen in previous videos, I've told you that we were the second house to build on in the street that I live in now. So that's how new the area is. So you find that before, the average price of rentals, and I am talking pre-COVID, just pre-COVID, like 2019, you could see the average price of rentals was about $350 a week for a 4-bedroomed house, for a 3-bedroom to 4-bedroomed house. So you'd get $350, and it was ranging from like $350 to like $400 for a bigger house, but it was quite affordable like in those days. But as of now, as we speak, the average price of rentals is now about $550 a week for the same property you used to pay $350 or $400 a week for. So as you can see, that really pushes people out of the market. And because sometimes people live on single incomes, it just makes it harder to afford housing. And those cost of living pressures are not only when it comes to accommodation, like prices of food, like prices of pretty much everything. Fuel is going up. So some people find the financial pressures too much, and they might be unable to find accommodation in the places that they want. So that is some of the reasons why we are having a crisis when it comes to housing, and people are having to move into their cars. People are moving in tents, as you saw in the clip before. People are moving in tents in parks. Just about 5 minutes drive from my house, I just saw that there's been a new tent that's been pitched in like a park kind of woodland area, which shows that someone is homeless and they are now living in that tent, which is something that we never used to see, especially in this area. But unfortunately, more and more people are having to move in like tents or into their cars with families and young children, which is quite unfortunate. And the other thing that is happening is because there is a housing shortage, you find that whenever there is a listing, whenever there's like a listing for a rental, there are so many people who are looking to get into that listing because there are fewer houses than people. I remember seeing a long queue of people, like it was so, I could say maybe 20 plus people lining up to view a property that had recently been opened up for rental in my suburb the other time. And it was shocking because I had never seen that before. You would just see the for rent sign and then it's removed, then it's been rented out. But you never used to see like queues of people lining up to view the property. And I actually have a friend of mine who was almost homeless because they could afford to rent a house, but because there were so many people on the property, like looking to rent out that property, they were kind of pushed out of the market, and they found it really, really hard to secure a place to live. Now, another thing that this introduces is discrimination when it comes to landlords selecting the people they want to rent their house. As you can imagine, if you have more options, you are likely to, you've got more choice as to who you want to rent your property. So there's a bit of like a hierarchy where people prefer a couple, a younger couple or older couple which has no kids as the first priority to rent their property. They prefer like a couple with dual income with no kids, and then dual income with no pets, and then it's dual income maybe with a pet but no kids, dual income with maybe not a lot of kids. So it goes down the chain, and as you can imagine, other factors come in like race and all other things like that. And this is something that I have heard from like some Africans who have been looking for houses, and they have felt that there has been discrimination when they come forward to apply for the rental, but then another person comes up and they're a more preferable like candidate for the landlord, which is quite unfortunate. So you see that these things are happening, and people are having to go under a lot of pressures to secure accommodation. Another thing that has been happening is that people are now throwing in these incentives in order for landlords to pick them. So people are offering to pay higher rent than what has been advertised for the property. People are offering to pay rent way in advance. For example, if you're required to pay rent 1 week in advance, like your rent, that's how your rental cycle works. Some people are offering to pay maybe 3 months rent in advance, and then, you know, just to make them more favorable for landlords to choose them. So it is becoming pretty competitive on the rental market. And in the suburb that I live in now, the average, like, you know, a property only stays on the market for less than 2 weeks. That's the average, like, turnover time for a property. So it doesn't, you know, last a long time on the market. And a lot of times you don't even see a for rent sign on the property like you used to see before. Like, you know, a property goes on rent, and because there's such a long list of people who are waiting for rentals, they get snatched up pretty quickly, you know, from the market without even having to go to be advertised. So, you know, I have just a few tips that I wanted to share that can hopefully help people secure housing and not become homeless here in Brisbane. So one of those tips is, this one is for people who are looking to immigrate to Brisbane. One thing is, I'll let you know, for an example, when I first moved to Brisbane, and this was way back in 2008, I remember I signed a 6-month lease. And that was because I was like, look, I'll go to this accommodation and I'll sign a shorter lease so that I can see how I like the place, and if I don't like it, I can look for other places, or if I like it, I can look to extend the lease. Now, this is something that I would strongly discourage for people who are looking to come into the rental market at the moment in Brisbane. I would say take the risk and just sign the longest lease that you can take. If it's a 12-month lease, sign a 12-month lease. Sign the longest lease. Don't like opt out of things like 3-month leases, 6-month leases, because you just have more protection when it comes to time. Like, you know, you don't risk like only moving in. Like, imagine immigrating from a whole different country coming to Brisbane, and you need to settle in, and on top of that having to deal with accommodation issues and the risk of being homeless. That can be very, very stressful. So the longer the lease that you sign, the more secure you are in the rental, and that is something that I would encourage at the moment. And then the other thing is to look for alternative types of accommodation that you might not have considered before. Things like share houses, you know, things like moving into a granny flat of a house. Now, if you don't know what a granny flat is, it's usually a little like building that is outside of the main house of, you know, in the yard. Like, there's the main house, and then there's a little house at the back, which is called a granny flat, which is usually a self-contained little 1-bedroom apartment. It's usually like where, you know, the grannies go and stay when they're a little bit older, instead of like going into a nursing home. I think that's where the concept comes from, where it's called a granny flat. But it's basically a little self-contained apartment at the back of a house. So you can look to, you know, rent those kind of properties. And another thing is, you know, there are some properties that are more available than others. Maybe a lot of people will be after 4-bedroomed houses because, you know, they've got the standard parents and 2 kids and they want a 4-bedroomed house. And, you know, maybe there's a lot more pressure on houses, I find, like, you know, 4-bedroomed houses, 3-bedroomed houses. If you can really just think of other ways that you can structure your accommodation. Like, maybe if you have 2 kids, like maybe the 2 kids can share a room and you can go for a 2-bedroom apartment instead of a 4-bedroom apartment or a 4-bedroomed house. Like, those are some of the things that you can think about. And also moving to different areas. I know this can be quite inconvenient when it comes to schools and stuff like that, but sometimes you might need to move to different suburbs than the ones that you wanted to move in, because that's where the rentals have become available. And the things that will have to change, maybe, you know, how you take kids to school, the schools that they go to and stuff. But it is in an effort to secure accommodation, which I think is more of a priority. So those are some of the things that you can think about to help you in the rental market. And if you are looking to move to Brisbane, please start looking for accommodation way in advance, and don't assume that it's going to be easy to get accommodation in Brisbane. Things are changing, unfortunately, and even on the news, they're always talking about, you know, the government looking for different strategies on how to tackle this housing crisis. And unfortunately, at the moment, there is no solution. So people are having to just, you know, roll with the punches, look for different strategies and stuff. And one unfortunate thing that I find about Australia is that the culture here is not the one that we have in Africa, where, for example, if you're home, like things like homelessness are quite rare because you always can live with a relative, you can move in with a relative and all that. But here I find that, you know, the culture is that people are more what can I say, like sticking to their families. Like people don't like live together like that, like they do in other cultures. So you might find that someone is homeless and living in a park or living in their car, but they do have relatives that are in the city. But you know, it's just that, you know, people don't have that culture of moving in with their relatives, or they don't have those type of relationships to the level that they could move in together, you know what I mean? So it makes it even harder for people. And imagine for immigrants who don't even have relatives or friends in the city, you don't have that option. So those are some of the things that you need to consider about the culture in Brisbane as well when it comes to housing crisis, that if you find yourself looking for a house, it might not be easy for you to just call a friend or call a relative and say, hey, can I move in with you for a couple of weeks or a couple of months while I try to settle and find my own accommodation. You're pretty much on your own. So you really need to think in advance, like be ahead of the game, think of different strategies, try and negotiate with your landlord when you see that your lease is up for renewal before it comes to that point where it has to be renewed. Try and, you know, really negotiate with your landlord to extend, because what's happening at the moment as well is landlords, when leases are coming to an end, they are ending the leases and not just automatically renewing them. Like it's not as easy as it was before. You just automatically renew for another 6 months, for example, or for another 12 months, but they're cutting that lease and then they're raising the price of rent, and then if you are willing to pay that price, then you sign a new lease. So maybe that's something that you can start to negotiate with your landlord, and maybe throw in some incentives, maybe that you pay rent way in advance, you pay a couple of months in advance, whatever it is that you can negotiate in order to secure housing, especially if you have young kids. Like, you know, having unstable living situation can be quite, you know, hard if you have young children. So those are some of the things that I just wanted to share that you can think about to make sure that you are not out of a home, that you do not find yourself homeless. And my heart really goes out to those families who are finding themselves homeless. Like, there are people that I know from work, just from, you know, friends that are in this situation, and there are people who are just like me, like we've got similar situations, similar circumstances, you know what I mean? Like, you know, we work at the same job, we earn similar income, but they're finding themselves in this situation. So it's really something that we need to think about, need to be serious about, need to consider, and make sure that our families are secure in the housing market. I hope that this video has been helpful to you, and I will see you in my next one.